So Agilfu is at Emma's wedding. His first wife is in. Now this is not as odd as it seems, because primogeniture has not even been decided in English politics, never mind in Viking politics, where actually Canut's reign is defined by how he balances these tensions, and he retains Agilfu. He doesn't just, it's not like, oh, she's my wife, I'm going to put her in a cupboard. He makes Agilfu a very, very, very senior advisor. And in fact, at the end of his reign, she's regent of Norway in her own right. Now, we don't talk much about the period of Canute and Emma, because we make out it was like the Wessex House, and then the Norman invasion that brutally took it. This is a whole very definite period that happened in between those times, and we need to discuss those times. So, because he's Danish, and because he's also a Danish king, all of a sudden he can deal with the Viking incursions that Ethelred could never ever have dealt with. Now, she wants everyone to believe that they're deeply in love. They're not. They have a very close working relationship, we can see that, but we can also see that the rivalry between her and his other existing wife, Agilfu, basically defines this age, and it ends up being fought out on the Battle of Hastings. Now, there's a lot of suggestions, because he didn't write, that he was madly in love with her. This is very unlikely. Now, I've just read a couple of studies of Canute, and he kept several countries together, Norway, Denmark, and England, through the clever use of his personal relationship. So actually, he appears to have used the rivalry between Emma and Agilfu. And he allows the emergence of a house, who you might reckon end up as Harold Godwin. And in my opinion, it's to keep Emma in check. Now, during this period, England goes through an unprecedented period of stability. This is like, but that's not how it starts off. And what's often described is Canute brutally starting his reign. I see no evidence that this is. One, Canute was using mercenary soldiers who he needed to pay off and send home. So what happens at the beginning of his reign is there is a cull of the Wessex House. A complete cull, one of the most efficient culls that you can imagine, and it's a cull that's very familiar in character to Norman development later on, because it's defined as much by what Emma and Canute keep as what they get rid of, and they refashion the machinery of the Wessex court to suit their aims. And in one fell swoop, every fucking successor to the throne that could challenge her children, who are safely in exile in Normandy, wiped out. And Canute does nothing like this, in the rest of his life that we can see. And this is very, very distinctive Norman development. So Canute's period of reign is so stable that he frequently goes back to Denmark for very long periods and feels safe to do so. Because in England, he's left the House of Godwin, who have emerged to keep Emma in check, and who represent often his ex-wife, his first wife Agilfu, and their children, and Harold Hereford, and this whole side of the family. But the administrative centre of this kingdom develops rapidly during this period. So Emma and Canute have gone from being a struggling little kingdom that's barely able to keep its own national borders to Canute is a king of 3 countries. So, you know, you're talking about people where they're still referencing Charlemagne, because that's not massively long ago. And he's the first king who's managed to recreate this multiple country deal. And they go to the A-list of monarchy. And they emerge onto the European stage, and you start seeing them all over European marriages. They have a daughter who, by the way, they call Gunhilda, after Svein the Forkbeard's sister, who was killed during the St. Brice Day massacre. And they name her after this woman. So this is an act of reconciliation. And Emma pulls off a fucking magic trick here. So she's managing to she's got all the Wessex power, because she's seen as ameliorating Canute. She has a considerable amount of power under her own right, because she understands and can do administrative politics in a way that Canute just cannot, because he can't read and write. And there's a massive development in our machinery at this point, which is distinctly Norman. And it would appear that Norman development in this country fully started with Emma of Normandy. And by the time Emma of Normandy had married Canute, the only fragments of the Wessex house that were left were her own children. All Wessex power was centred around a Norman for her to exercise freely, which she did. And this country goes through a massively important period of development and stability. And one of the puzzles, because Canute's empire falls apart the minute he dies because he doesn't name a successor, is how is it, if he can't read and write, England goes from the period where under Ethelred they can barely secure their borders to Edward the Confessor, who is a highly envied, centralised, powerful, controlled economy, and, you know, they have created the seeds of a state. And the answer is that it's her. It can only have been her. Now, what you have to understand about Norman development of the period is that actually it had only just begun. And like Skidelsky says, that the mark of success for a system is how it reproduces itself. What was formed in Norman France there through this generation of Emma's family was a model of development that would reproduce itself and reshape Europe for the next 1,000 years. In fact, arguably 2,000 maybe. And this woman, she not only was this the period before the Norman invasion, so not only has she done this before William the Conqueror started, she has laid the way for William the Conqueror. It's very likely agreements that she made that led to, you know, what was fought out on the Battle of Hastings. She's also the first Norman to achieve these heights. She's the first Norman to not only get one kingdom, but 3. You know, she's the first to show that this is possible. And she's actually central to both the formation of the French national identity, of the Norman identity, of the Norman model of development. She's the blueprint for our model of queenship, and through her reformation of the British state in this period, you see the blueprint for the Norman invasion. Now, when Canute dies, like, this woman is fucking vicious. She's a politician and then some. And she exercises power in her own right. And David Starkey describes her as the axis around which Britain and European politics spun, and that's highly likely to be true. And in fact, she loses the throne for a period after Canute dies because Harold Harefoot takes it, who's one of his children, through a Guilford. And it's through here that you see that actually the House of Godwin was very much about representing that model of Scandinavian power and Canute's first wife and that power base, rather than anything to do with the Wessex House. And what's fought out on the Battle of Hastings is, in essence, 2 types of Viking power. And the battle between them was not won on the Battle of Hastings. It was about the fact that one of them had embraced reading and writing and record keeping and political kind of machinery and the use of religion as a way to exercise political power, and the other had not. And it's highly unlikely, like, William the Conqueror would absolutely have been the successor to Edward the Confessor's throne. That would have been agreed a long time before Edward the Confessor died. So this is like, once you actually understand what this woman has done, you understand kind of the Battle of Hastings an awful lot better. But she continues, like, although she loses the throne for 3 years under Harold Harefoot, her son Harthcanute ends up on the throne, and then Edward the Confessor ends up on the throne. And throughout the entirety of her life, she is incredibly, incredibly powerful. And she is involved in statecraft, and she is involved in really shaping politics, and she is involved in dynastic politics, and in marriages, and charters, and she is, like, more or less a queen regnant through Canute, through Harold Harefoot. She loses position during Harold Harefoot, but she fucking holds on for her own kids. And then she more or less rules in her own right under Harthcanute. And it's actually only under Edward the Confessor that she's neutralised. And while we don't know for sure what happened, we know that at some point in kind of her 60s, so she's really fucking old by this point, she has to be neutralised. And there are various stories. There's a story that she was on trial in a church and had to walk over hot coals, which are just nonsense. But these stories allude to the fact that there was some kind of public disgrace. And we have two accounts of her being neutralised, and we know that at the very least something happened, and it looks highly likely to me like she just decided she didn't want to be part of a mobile court anymore, and she was a bit old to be trundling around the country, so she decided to hole up at Winchester. And while we don't know the exact details of what happened, we know that it took Edward the Confessor, Harold Godwin, and Lord Leofric, which is basically two earls and a fucking king, to requisition the best part, a chunk of the royal treasury, a chunk of an armoury, and a bunch of holy relics. And they had to literally issue a statement saying, this woman is just an old woman now. She is not queen regnant. She has no power, and she had to be publicly stripped of power by a king and 3 earls in her fucking 60s. And part of the reason that she has been written out of our history is that after the Norman invasion, the Wessex identity that we as modern readers understand was formed under resistance to the Normans and has very little relationship to the actual reality of the Wessex dynasty. And so we have completely written this period where our country solidified and went onto the European stage and went into stratosphere at the A-list, and where the roots of all our institutions were formed, and literally institutions that are still functioning now were formed here. And the woman, she makes, like, you can't find Emma in the history books. If you look through the Wessex histories, you can see a fragment of her. If you look through Danish accounts, you can see a fragment of her. If you go through Norman history, you see a fragment of her. But if you bring all three together and you lay them over each other, she emerges as the most powerful woman of her period, and the woman around which the English national identity was actually formed. And then she's completely written out of history with Canute after the Norman invasion, where we reconstruct for ourselves a new version of Wessex as the rightful kings of England, and Alfred the Great and Athelstan, and we, you know. But actually what's fought out on the Battle of Hastings is the house that emerged to keep her in check and represent Canute's first wife, more or less. And the first Norman power and the first Norman Reformation of the English system. And, you know, this woman was brutal. Edward the Confessor basically openly said she was a terrible mother. And the people at the time knew she was mendacious. Like, she commissioned a history called the Emmaconium, which would make Pierre Mendelssohn blush. It's such a work of political mendaciousness that's all about, and it's a living political document where she's telling enough lies to make sure that her children get on the throne. But by the time she's done, she's been politically active in the axis around which politics has spun for most of her adult life since about the age of 30. She's been the mother of 2 kings and the wife of 2 kings. And the imprint that she made not only shaped normal development, English development, our national identity, the French national identity, but then we've completely written her out of history. And there was 1,000 years between Boudicca and Emma of Normandy, and there's been another 1,000 years between Emma of Normandy and now. There's now no other son, really, is there?